Moving along in Gebser then here, we move to Chapter 2, and in Volume 2, Chapter 2 is called The New Mutation. Um, Before we get to that, though, I wanted to mention I saw the movie Sphere a couple of nights ago. This was a science fiction film from the 90s that I had missed, with Dustin Hoffman and Sharon Stone, and directed by Barry Levinson. And I thought it was interestingly susceptible to a kind of Sloterdijkian Gebserian analysis. It's based on a novel by Michael Crichton. And in the film, a team of scientists, as in Jurassic Park, is assembled together to descend down, like in the movie The Abyss, to descend down beneath the waves to find a sunken spaceship, and they go inside of it. And inside the spaceship is a beautiful gold sphere just sitting there. When a cosmology disintegrates, what happens to it is that it doesn't just disappear for good. It sinks below the threshold of a cultural collective unconscious. And the cosmology sits there, below the threshold, and it makes appearances in the visual imagery produced by the arts of that culture. And in this case, we find that the old Ptolemaic spherical cosmology has disappeared below the threshold. Down beneath the waves is a symbol for down beneath into the collective unconscious of Western civilization, where they encounter it. And when the characters go inside of it, they come out with the ability to materialize their wishes or their fears inadvertently. Whatever they're afraid of, or particularly what they're afraid of, appears in concrete form. For example, a giant squid appears and it attacks the group as a concretization of one character's having read the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Another character is afraid, was stung by jellyfish as a child, so a bunch of aggressive jellyfish appear that sting to death one of the characters, and so on. So the function of this sphere in this narrative now is not to protect a cosmology, but rather to function as a miniaturization now. Once it sinks beneath the threshold into the depths of consciousness, it becomes a miniaturization of Gebser's magical consciousness structure, which is cavern-like, and when the waking consciousness descends down into it and works with things like magic rituals, prayer, telepathy, it can actually make things happen, realize and concretize things in the manifold of time and space. Actual physical things can happen. This is why yogis are able to, they're masters they're adepts at descending down into this mythical, or rather magical cavern consciousness structure, and then manipulating reality to make magical things happen. They're masters at this. So it becomes the magical consciousness structure, sinks below the threshold, and then at the end of the film, it rises up to the heavens. We see it emerge out of the ocean, and it goes right back up to the heavens, where was its rightful place initially. The last time we saw the macrosphere was with Copernicus, who was the last man to demolish them and put an end to, or rather the first man to demolish them and put an end finally to the last of the great macrospheres. In Indian mythology, of course, or in Indian metaphysics, the spheres function as the chakras, so that in Western cosmology, we didn't have the chakras, but what we did have were the 9 celestial spheres. The 9 includes the planetary spheres plus the sphere of the fixed stars, as well as the Earth, and each one of these spheres had a different archetypal quality associated with it. Like Venus, for example, was associated with sexuality, the sphere of Mars with physical aggression and warfare, Mercury with the intellect, and so on. Exactly as in Indian tradition, we have Kundalini Yoga with the idea of activating the serpent at the root base, the Muladhara chakra, which then ascends up through the center of the spinal column to inseminate the brain, as it were, through the 7 chakras, each of which has its own archetypal power, then in a way is very similar to the Western outer-directed cosmology. And I was thinking too about Gebser, about expanding his model in terms of the way the Kundalini descends down into the deepest depths of the psyche, by thinking about the so-called the architecture of the brain in terms of the reptilian brain, and on top of that we have the mammalian brain and then the neocortex as it has evolved over millennia. And I think that the reptilian brain has its own kind of consciousness structure. It's a fight or flight consciousness structure that's concerned simply with reproduction and survival and has no emotional warmth to it. It's cold-blooded reptilian and so forth. and it might constitute its own basal sort of consciousness structure, which would be older than the archaic consciousness structure, and we might consider it something like, on the analogy of an Eo consciousness structure, or a dawn consciousness. And then on top of that, with the advent of mammals, we get the shift from the birth through an egg via the birth through the mother's body, which becomes, the egg becomes internalized as a kind of internal apartment. As Peter Sloterdijk says, woman was the first apartment. And we have the evolution, the innovation rather, of birth through the womb. And then we have the mammalian consciousness, which is associated with emotional warmth. Mammals nurture their young, they take care of them, they're concerned with them through their early phases anyway. And so we might have a mammalian consciousness structure on top of the reptilian, and might call it sort of pre-archaic consciousness structure. And in that case, the archaic consciousness structure would then come in with the rise of the neocortex and the hominid evolution. 5 million years of that brings us down to the Paleolithic, 100,000 or so years ago, and then we shift into the magical consciousness structure. Then along comes the Neolithic and the development of farming communities, and in this chapter, Gebser gives better dates for the time period that he thinks that the mythical consciousness structure began to come about. Before he had been rather vague about it, I had assumed that he was talking about the Bronze Age, or at best, at earliest, the late sort of pottery Neolithic, with the first appearance of mandalas and seasonal festivals and so forth. Seasonal festivals, though, do probably go back to 10,000 BC, to the birth of the first farming communities in the Middle East at places like Ebert, and the sites that are located up along the upper Euphrates River in Syria. That's where we first, Abu Huraira is one of the first great village sites. That's where we first see the farming traditions beginning to come in. And Gebser says in this chapter that he thinks that the magical should be identified with hunters and nomads and animal domesticators and breeders, but that the mythical consciousness structure should be identified with the farming, agricultural world, since this is the world of the matriarchy, the world of the rise of the mother goddess is the dominant figure. She personifies and typifies the soil. And it's during this period that human sacrifice begins to first come in, although we don't see any evidence for human sacrifice until we get down to about 8000 BC at the site of Chayonu, which is a village also in eastern Syria, not far from these early dawn settlements, these proto-settlements of Abu Huraira and Muraybat. Chayonu is a creepy site. It's a farming site at which was found underneath a kind of rectangular temple caches and hordes of human skulls that were just piled up, together with a sacrificial altar table. Knives were found there made out of obsidian with blood stains on them, blood stains on the sacrificial altar, and it looks very much like human sacrifice was not only up and running at Chayonu, but that it was a ghastly industry on the level of the Aztecs, or later the Hindus with their mother goddess, the sacrifice to Kali. It was a big industry there in India. So it looks as though human sacrifice begins to come in around 8000 BC. So by that point, we're definitely in, according to Gebser, the mythical consciousness structure with the rise of the matriarchy and so forth. And he says that also during this period, what happened was a process of what he calls the denaturation of human culture, in which there was the beginnings of a shifting as culture moved away from the world of the animals and plant domestication, and then on into approaching the Bronze Age, with the rise of the crafts, metallurgy and pottery and irrigation and the various bead working and shaping and the sculpting of cylinder seals and precious gems, and then of course the advent of writing and the building of metal weapons and so forth. This is the rise of the craft traditions, which Gebser says signifies a denaturation process, whereas the earlier period had been concerned with the manipulation of living things, technologies based on the manipulation of plants and animals. Now we have, as we approach the Bronze Age, technologies based on the manipulation of inanimate objects and metals and materials and mineralogy and geology, and all of that begins to come in. So there's a denaturation process that begins to take place that gradually removes and divorces the human being from the original matrix of technology having to do with the manipulation of living things. Then he says, likewise today, since the Industrial Revolution, we have been undergoing a process of deculturation, not denaturation, insofar as that with the rise of the machine and the Industrial Revolution, we're beginning to get the effacing and displacement of culture by the machine. The machine effaces and obsolesces the handicraft tradition. Of course, we got the big reaction against this in the 19th century with men like John Ruskin and William Morris, who wanted to emphasize going back to the making of objects in a fine, shaker furniture and the handcraft tradition, authentic things as Heidegger would think of them. So we have a deculturation process there. So notice that Gebser agrees with Spengler that in the 19th century there did begin to become a replacement of culture and a decline of culture and an obsolescence of culture in favor of the rise of the machine, which is the extreme outcome of the deficient mode of the rational consciousness structure as it begins to devolve and move into its deficient phase and begins to replace the qualitative early phase of the efficient consciousness structure with a quantitative deficient phase that begins to spread across the earth, and the machine begins to replace human culture and human spiritual consciousness. So that's what he talks about in this chapter, in the latter half of the chapter, which he calls the theme of the new mutation. But in the first half of the chapter, backtracking a bit here, which is called the climate of the new mutation, we see Gebser, I think for the first time in this book, shifting into a kind of an apocalyptic messianic mode, in which he announces the aperspectival integral consciousness structure as the dawning of a new age. Of course, New Age thinking is something that came about in the middle of the 19th century, toward the last few decades, with Annie Besant and Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy, and then Rudolf Steiner, who was originally part of the Theosophical movement and then broke away from them when he realized that they were basically charlatans and frauds. But the whole New Age, the idea of the enunciation of a new age, of moving into out of industrial civilization into a new spiritually based civilization, what Rudolf Steiner called and saw, what corresponds in his thinking to Gebser's aperspectival and McLuhan's electric acoustic phase space and Spengler's decline, is what Rudolf Steiner announced as the descent of the archangel Michael, which he says descended to the earth during this period and shifted into the advent of a new millennium of spiritually inclined consciousness. And the New Age, of course, has all along been in a slow, gradual process of decay as it has moved from the great 60s explosion, in which there was real, actual thought in the New Age, with thinkers like Alan Watts and Joseph Campbell and Buckminster Fuller and John Lilly, Gregory Bateson, and all these individuals that were associated with the New Age in terms of having actual intellect, to in the 1980s, as William Irwin Thompson describes in his book about the imagination of the New Age, the reimagination of the world, with David Spengler, in which he talks about the decline of the New Age with the rise of Shirley MacLaine, and then later with Deepak Chopra. We move into a vulgar period where it becomes more associated with the self-help movement and with the emotions, and seeing the intellect now as a liability and something to be dismantled, pulled apart, and gotten rid of, in favor of just pure emotional sputtering and splurging, a kind of Lavic explosion of emotionality, as though that were somehow what we were put here on this earth to do, is just to feel. The intellect obviously has been evolved through millions of years as a tool. It's not something that we can afford to do away with. It has to be used to sort the psyche out. But nonetheless, then the New Age winds up, of course, in the late 90s, disintegrating and dissolving into Eckhart Tolle and individuals of this kind, Daniel Pinchbeck, who are individuals who are just recycling cliches, New Age cliches from these earlier generations, and there's no new thought, and there's nothing original. It's just endless recycling of proverbs, cliches, stereotypes, proverbial wisdom, and so forth. So the New Age is really finished. But I think with Gebser in this chapter, we begin to see him moving into this apocalyptic mode. And he says that once a consciousness structure begins to move into a deficient epoch, when it begins to decline, and it's overlapping into an age of a new consciousness structure that's beginning to emerge in its efficient mode, there's a period of noise there, static, as it were, is like trying to tune in as you move from one radio station to the next, and you get all the static, which is basically cosmologically the same idea as a pralaya. In Indian cosmology, this is the ending of a world age as it declines and disintegrates and then begins to inaugurate a new cycle. And there's a pralaya, a sort of Baconian ricorso, in which the culture forms disintegrate into a state of chaos. And he says that's what has been happening with Western civilization since the 19th century, as it moves from the mental consciousness structure in its deficient mode as the rational consciousness structure into the rise of the efficient phase of the aperspectival integral consciousness structure. And he says that sometimes what will happen during these phases is that, I'm running out of time here.